Good morning, everyone. As you can see, I'm not officially back yet, but I wanted to make this video in order to introduce myself and to give you the introductory lecture that I had intended to give you during the second class. First class went exactly as planned. Dr. Dunwoody, thank you to Dr. Dunwoody for coming in and explaining the syllabus to you and going over the basic class things that you needed to know. But then after that, I had you watch a video because obviously I'm home recovering from surgery, so I wasn't able to give you the lectures that I had planned to give you. So today what we're going to do is go through the first part of that lecture that I wanted to give you, just to get us going in the right direction. And since I had assigned chapter 1 of the Schulman book as your assigned reading for today, I'm going to cover probably about half the chapter during this video lecture, and I'm going to cover the rest on Friday. So the goal here is to record this video lecture and record one for Friday. I should be back, unless something goes horribly wrong, I should be back in the classroom for you on Monday. Fingers crossed. So that's the goal. So unless something goes really wrong, you will only get 2 of these video lectures, and then I will be there in person. So since I didn't get a chance to introduce myself at the beginning of term, I thought it would be good to give you a brief idea of who I am. Show you my face. I know the ad drop date is coming up on Friday, so you might want to know who is actually teaching the course. And then this introductory lecture will also give you an idea of what to expect for the rest of the term. As you were told in the beginning, we are using the 2 books, so I have one of them here. Apparently I didn't bring the other one over, but we do have the Schulman book, which is the presentation of self in contemporary social life, this one. And we also have the classical studies one, the one where we look at the experiments that have traditionally been done in social psychology. So, but like I said, because I didn't get a chance to introduce myself at the beginning of term, I thought this would be a good time to give you an idea of who I am. And what's interesting is that this is my unique opportunity to have almost 100% control over my impression management, over how I get you guys to think about me, at least in my head. So, I'm going to be able to edit this video to show my face when I want to. I'll put up the slides when I want to. I can add or remove audio. My goal here is actually not to do that. So I want you to actually hear me lecture as I would lecture. But it is a little strange recording and talking to myself in my own apartment at 7 o'clock in the morning when I'm recovering from surgery. So I'll do my best to be myself and as natural as possible, but we have to keep in mind that I am basically recording a YouTube video for you. So I get to write exactly what I want to write on the slides. So if you look at the slide here, you can see I've put my education background. I am an ABD PhD student here at U of A, so I'm studying sociology and humanities computing, which is eventually going to be called digital humanities from what I understand, but it is the study of digital humanities. I put my dissertation title up there for you. You can sort of gather what it's about through that. Basically what I did was, I'm at the point now where I recorded several Let's Plays, so sitting in front of a computer like this, only playing video games from my childhood, in order to trigger memories that will allow me to study alienation as sort of this representation of a lack of a relationship to yourself and to the world around you. So it's considered to be a relation of relationlessness. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's not what this course is about. Anyway, so I study the videos that I created autoethnographically. So I'm doing research on myself with myself as a participant, and through that I investigate social interactions through and around games and game culture, primarily video games, but also games like Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. So I look at how those games helped me through childhood and helped me even as an adult relate to other people and socialize, and I sort of expand that to talk about society in general and how game culture can help overcome things like alienation through collective play and shared experiences. So that's the brief statement of my giant dissertation that's still in progress. And as you can tell, one of my primary research interests is video games. So social interactions with and around video games and video game culture. I'm also interested in classical and contemporary social theory. So you'll see later that a big part of this course has to do with my interest in classical theory, like Goffman, people like Zimmel and Durkheim, names that'll come up throughout the course. The digital humanities part of what I do, I'm largely interested in computer-assisted text analysis and text mining. So in relation to my dissertation, what I've done is I've transcribed all of the videos that I've made, which total about 140,000 words, as well as my reactions during the videos. And I am currently in the process of tagging that information, so I go through and I it's a bit complicated, but I go through and I tag things like nouns and games, and I tell the computer what different words actually mean. And then the next step over the next couple of months is to run it through the computer with various programs to find out sort of objectively what the computer can come up with as far as themes and understanding my data. I'll also be analyzing my data myself, subjectively, but because it's such a personal project, I thought that the computer analysis would help me present sort of an objective view. So that's pretty much that slide. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to drink coffee as I go because I haven't spoken to a lot of people in the last week or so, and I'm still recovering from the surgery. So if you have coffee, join me. Okay. So that's an introduction to me. Now, of course, I'm well aware that we live in a time where many of you might have Googled your professors before the start of term, myself included. If you did, you likely formulated an idea in your head about who I am, what I'm like as a person, what I'm like as an instructor. I have Googled myself, so I do know mainly what's on Google about me. So I know that I can't completely control my impression management. I can't completely control your understanding of me even through this video, even with the amount of control I have with editing and timing and all that stuff, because you have this previous information about me. And that's something important to keep in mind, is you do have this background information if you Googled me. If you didn't, cool, let's get to know each other. Now, with my emergency surgery and sort of the unorthodox nature of this lecture format, that all throws a bit of a wrench into things as well, because I'm unable to determine what impressions you may have formed during my absence. You have had guest lecturers, you've watched, 12 Angry Men. I haven't been there, and I'm not there right now, so I can't actually see your reactions. I can't ask you questions. I can't garner any feedback from you. So this is quite a different, unique sort of way to do this introduction, but I think it's interesting because as I go through everything I present on the slides, everything I have in the background in my apartment here, gives you an insight into who I am beyond the professor persona, which is what I wish to portray in a classroom setting. So I'm filming in my apartment. You're getting a glimpse of my backstage. If you did your reading, you should have an introduction to that, but we will talk about that more as the course goes on. But you get a glimpse into this backstage part of my identity. And there are things that I may not choose to perform in a classroom setting. My rug in the background, I have a dog, and she's been chewing her bone on it, so it's not vacuumed. You can see how my walls are decorated. You can see things behind me. What kind of chair I sit in, all sorts of things like that. I've invited you sort of into my home, which gives you this different perspective. So this is really where I practice and prepare my role of professor or student, or whatever it is whatever role or persona it is that I'm going to play that day. But you're in the place where it's usually my backstage. It's usually the place where I get to prepare on my own. So that's quite interesting about this video, and something to keep in mind as we go through everything we go through over the course. So, a little bit more coffee because I can. Okay, so let's move forward. So since I missed out on the introduction during the second class, I want to explain why we're reading the Schulman book in particular and why we're focusing on dramaturgy for much of the course. I want you to think about the two definitions that are up on the slides here. The definition of social psychology, which I showed on the slide in the first class, I believe. At least they are on e-class, so you can see the slides that I had put up. Anyway, so the sort of traditional, this is a melding of various definitions, but they all sort of say the same thing, that social psychology is the scientific study of how the real, implied, or imagined presence of others influences a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Now, this is really important, and I'm sorry if you can hear my phone vibrating in the background. I should probably turn that off. In fact, I'm going to take advantage of the situation I'm in and turn it off right here in front of you. So it stops vibrating and bugging us. How's that sound? Let's see if I can do it. Okay. Yes, so social psychology. So that's the definition. And the really important thing is to think about is how is this idea of the real, implied, or imagined presence of others. So as I'm recording this video right now, I'm not reacting to your actual presence. I'm recording this on Tuesday. You're going to see this on Wednesday. No one's here looking at me at the moment. And so what I'm doing and how I'm speaking is based on sort of the implied presence or my imagined presence of you. I'm trying to picture 80 of you, because you all come to class all the time, right? I'm picturing 80 of you sitting in front of me. I have been in the classroom, so I do have a general idea of what it looks like. So I'd be standing at the front. There's those lovely, comfortable chairs that you guys are sitting in, sort of in front of me. And so I'm imagining speaking to you as I'm speaking to the camera. Again, not as effective, and in class I probably wouldn't be sitting down, and I wouldn't have the ability to edit anything, but you get the point. It's, if we look at this from a social psychology perspective, it's sort of studying, we want to study scientifically how my imagined, or how you guys being in front of me, or how I imagine you being in front of me affects my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And the scientific study is the part where we bring in the other textbook, the classical studies. So we're going to spend time looking at individual social psychological experiments from the past, analyzing them, looking at the methodology and the process and how these experiments were run and what they studied and, you know, their benefits, their flaws. We're going to go through all that sort of stuff. So the scientific study is important, but we're also going to study sort of a theoretical perspective. So moving forward, I also took the definition of sociology. I took it from the University of Alberta Sociology Department website because that's where we are. And I wanted to use that to guide the course along. So social psychology has we have Soc 241, and then there's Psych 241. And the psychology students, it's mandatory to take the psychology version of social psychology, and for sociology students, they can take the sociology version of social psychology. And sociology really, you know, we can define it in a variety of ways, but we can just look at it primarily as the study of the social aspects of human existence. It's broad, it's very general, but it's a definition that gives us a good idea of the foundation of sociology. So, you know, you can look into it in many different ways. There are many different definitions, but that's the one we're going to sort of stick with. So if we think about these two definitions, they are quite broad, like I said, especially the sociology one. Now I'm thinking back that this is the second time teaching this course. So the first time I taught this course over the summer, I used a sort of more traditional social psychology textbook. It would be this one here. And so it does have, you know, the traditional sort of chapter outlines with all of the all of the goodies. It focuses on, very specific topics in social psychology like the self, social perception, research methods, stereotypes, group processes, intergroup relations, aggression, love, and it's a great book, and it's a great way to do a course. But at the same time, I thought we'd do something a little bit different, something a little bit more specialized to me. So we are going to explore many of the concepts in a book like that. I'm not going to use that specific book, but there are, general concepts that are common to all intro social psychology books. But I wanted to use this course to look at what I see as sort of the distinctly sociological parts of social psychology. And I primarily bring that down to the study of interactions, of social interactions, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. I'm going to drink some coffee. Because I don't have you guys here with me to control my pace, so I want to make sure that I'm not overwhelming you and speaking too quickly, which I do tend to do in front of a camera. I've watched many videos of myself, so I'm aware that I speak a lot and quite quickly. But in class, I'll be looking for feedback from you. I'll be able to feed off the audience, and I'll be able to have a better understanding of if you guys understand, if you're following along, etc. But because I don't have that cue right now, I'll use coffee. Anyway, so if this was an intro to sociology course, we would probably spend a lot of time looking at larger social institutions. There's a big criminology section here at the U of A, and a lot of people study things like prisons and, one professor, she studies street gang interactions and group dynamics, and so we could be studying things like power dynamics, or something that Emile Durkheim calls social facts, which are basically social things that exist outside of any individual person. I am a fan of Durkheim, so we may talk about him later, and I may assign a reading. And really, Durkheim, Goffman, who we're going to focus a lot on because that's sort of the book is playing off of Goffman. But these classical theorists we're gonna focus on. But Durkheim really said that society, social interactions, sociology in general consists of the study of social facts, so things that no individual makes, but society in general makes. He studied a lot of things like rituals, how people perform in religious situations. So one person doesn't create a ritual in a religion. It's something that develops socially and has rules and understandings that are social and socially created. So if we were going to be doing sort of a broad intro to sociology course, we'd be talking about these larger things that exist outside of individuals. But since social psychology involves individual persons' thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, if we look back at the definition, I want to focus on what's called microsociology, sort of the small one-on-one group interactions that make up our daily lives. This is the type of sociology that I've primarily focused on with my research, and when writing papers and going through my master's. I was really interested in microsociology, as well as impression management. And impression management is actually something I looked at during my undergraduate degree in psychology, so I wanted to bring all these things together to do this course. So that's why we're doing the course the way we are. So we're not using one of those big textbooks, because I thought we could bring in more things that I'm actually not an expert in, but I'm far more comfortable and familiar with, and I think I can portray to you a lot better. So like I said, we're going to study microsociological interactions and take a microsociological approach to look at these small-scale interactions. So what I was talking about before about institutions and social facts and broader power structures, that's considered to be macro-sociology, if we're going to talk about the difference between the two, which is a lot of, what a lot of sociologists study. But microsociology, basically, if you have two people interacting, we can study that sociologically from a microsociological perspective. Now, you've noticed in the book that Schulman talks about something called symbolic interactionism, and that basically talks about how people share and exchange symbols. Um, there's a book, I've got the book here. Should have made them easier to access. Herbert Bloomer, this is a really good book on social interactionism. I'm not going to make you read it. It's long and there's a lot of detail in it. And my computer just made noise. But basically, Herbert Bloomer came up with sort of three sort of three primary definitions that I've got listed on the slide there. So in symbolic interactionism, people act towards things based on the meaning that those things have for them. So, you know, the way I react to a classroom, I do that based on the meaning that classroom has for me. It's based on the meaning that professor has for me. These words, whether they're words or objects, they're symbols that represent certain things to me. And so I react and act on them based on those meanings that I have for them. The next part of that is that these meanings are developed socially. They're developed through social interaction. So the basic idea is that every time a social interaction occurs and symbols are exchanged, whether they're words, actions, objects, whatever it is, meaning is derived and created and developed and advanced and changed for the people in that interaction. So meaning, it keeps developing as interactions occur. And meanings are handled through interpretation, which, you have a certain understanding of what classroom means, and I have a certain understanding of what classroom means. As we go through this course, the meaning, we're going to interpret classroom from both perspectives. The meaning may not change a lot, but we're going to add to our meaning. We're going to sort of change and evolve the meaning as we go, and we're going to interpret the next time we experience classroom based on the meaning that has now developed based on our interactions. So that's primarily what symbolic interactionism is about. So we explore how people share and exchange symbols. Symbols, they hold social meaning. We exchange, interpret, and derive meaning from the symbols whenever we interact with others. Our use of symbols, words, signs, gestures, the things I'm doing with my hands, they allow us to be social. So instead of just sitting here reading a script, I'm actually interacting as if I'm face-to-face with a person, because various gestures, eye contact, the way I move my hands, the way I speak, that all portrays some meaning to you, and it has meaning for me. As Schulman states at the end of chapter 1, quick aside, I have been trying to, it's been pointed out to me that some people have the electronic version of the Schulman book. So from now on, when I assign readings, I'm going to try to also assign, instead of just page numbers, I'm going to work on assigning sections or chapters to make sure that you guys with the ebook have an equal opportunity to do the readings properly. So I won't be able to give you page numbers for all the quotes to the ebook people, because I don't have the ebook version, but we'll try to balance it out, and if you need me to find something for you, let me know. Anyway, as Schulman states at the end of chapter 1, quote, the knowledge that meaning is captured in symbols allows people to be strategic planners of interaction and to be conscious of us and all other actors out there, unquote. So if we move forward from symbolic interactionism and talk about the dramaturgical perspective, the dramaturgical perspective was what allows us to analyze these micro-sociological interactions in order to understand how people interact, how they perform roles, how they portray personas, how they express values, and how they predict the behavior of others in order to preserve their sense of self, their place in the social world, their identity, how to perform, how to interact. The dramaturgical perspective gives us a way to study this. So we're using Goffman and the dramaturgy as a basis for this course, because it's sort of an intuitive and useful way to explore these key processes in social psychology, while doing it through the lens of sociological theory. So, you know, there's many different ways to look at things, but I've chosen this particular form of analysis because it's going to give us the opportunity to talk about things like backstage and the audience and the self as it relates to performance and how we do things in front of each other. So that's sort of how this course is developed, and that's why we're doing it that way. So we're ideally, at this point, we've moved from the definition of social psychology through sociology. We've talked about microsociology, symbolic interactionism, and how dramaturgy will allow us to look at that sort of stuff. Your reading of chapter 1 should also make this a bit clearer, and as we go through the course and fine-tune each thing, so we will look at the concept of the self, for example. We will look at backstage. We will look at audience expectations and feedback. We will look at all these things through the course. And as we do that, we'll be able to understand how to study these microsociological interactions in order to understand how the real, implied, or imagined presence of others influences the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of other people. So through the investigation of interactions, we're going to learn about social psychology. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, at this point, I would ask you if you had any questions or needed anything clarified. I'm going to say again at the end, please do email me if you have any major questions, but also keep in mind that I will be in class in person on Monday, ideally. So it could also work if you write down some of your questions. I'll give us some time to go through the video or go through any questions you have from today's video and from Friday's video to help clarify and make sure that we're all on the same page. So don't worry, I will give us time for that, because I know this, again, is sort of a strange situation. So how sociologists basically study dramaturgy is through the investigation of nonfiction performances. So as you can see from the slide, Schulman states that nonfiction performance involves actions, communications, and intentions that audiences should interpret as real, that happen in real life and in real time. And that's page 5 if you have the book, and chapter 1 in general if you have the ebook. So basically what we do, I mean, it's not basic. Scientifically, we can pick apart the day-to-day interactions and situations that make up social life. We can also do that theoretically, and we're going to talk about both sort of factors. And when we do talk about classical experiments, I will bring in dramaturgy, and when I talk about dramaturgy, we will try to bring in other social psychological concepts as we go. As we learn these key terms throughout the course, if there's something that we talk about, whether it is or isn't in the book, if it's not in the book, I will put the definition up on the slides. And I do also have a glossary in eClass that you can go to. So when you open eClass, there should be there's a mirror image here happening. So on the top right part of the screen, when you open eClass, there should be a little glossary entry. And I've got that on random. So right now we have 3 definitions in there. I'm going to add more likely after I finish recording this video, so by the time you see it, there'll be more definitions. But that's a good place to go to do a flashcard study of some of the key things that we're going to look at in the course. So yeah, it'll help you with studying and understanding, but any terms that I bring up that aren't specifically found in either of the books, you can find them on the glossary and in the slides as we go. So that is that part. So we do look at nonfiction performances, but because of my interest in games and culture and things like that, we're also going to be studying fictional performances. And really, they're the same and they're different, because any performance that we look at, whether, if we're reading about an example in a book, whether it happened in real life or it happened fictionally, it's still an interaction, and it's still something we can look at. So granted, in things like games and videos, movies, books, some interactions are poorly written, may not be that realistic, and I think we tend to be pretty good at picking that out. But our goal is going to be, when we do look at fictional performances, like 12 Angry Men, for example, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, we want to be able to look through and see and be able to talk about things like backstage and setting and interactions and audience expectations and all of these things we're going to talk about in dramaturgy. We want to understand the real world, but we can also use the fictional world to do that. So we'll also talk about things like Facebook and YouTube. Again, like I said, video game interactions. And the sort of the back part of Schulman's book does talk about internet interactions a lot. So we can have a discussion about whether those are nonfiction performances or fiction performances. I want you to spend time thinking about what the difference between the two are. So if we're interacting on Facebook, or what I'm doing right now, I would consider this to be a nonfiction performance, but it's also something that I'm performing that isn't happening in real time. So the way I'm speaking right now isn't actually happening in real life, but it is. So there's a really strange line that's drawn, or hard to draw, when we start bringing in things like digital media and movies, etc., etc. So we're going to study fictional and non-fictional performances as we go. Now I want us to think about and talk about why we watched 12 Angry Men, and what we can take away from it, and what I want you to take away from it. If you missed part of class, I do believe that you can find a really poor version on YouTube if you look it up. But it pretty much cuts off a lot of people's heads and you don't get to see all the interactions. So hopefully you were in class and hopefully you got to see the movie. There are many synopses online available, synopses, that you can go through and read about the different characters and get a better understanding of the movie. If you're concerned about testing and things like that, I did assign that reading, that article about 12 Angry Men, that I'm actually going to go through and look at a little bit here. So that is part of the assigned readings, and I do want to make sure that you've read that, and keep in mind that we might talk about that during, at least during the midterm. As you remember from the syllabus, the exams are cumulative, so the final exam may include a question about 12 Angry Men in it. So again, you want to, if you didn't see the movie, at least go on and read some synopses about it. I encourage you to see it, though, if you didn't, because it's a really good movie. Okay, so I had you read that article, and it describes some of the main social psychological phenomena found in the film. And I'm going to pull it up here and actually just sort of quickly go through some of the key points. The article is really well written because it sort of gives us a general intro to social psychology overview about what to look for in the movie, and it actually says that. So one of the interesting things about the article is that it does what we want to do with other media and with studying social interactions and with studying microsociology. We want to look at all the different key points. We want to pick it apart, and that's what this article does, and it actually argues for that, saying that we should do this more often. So, I mean, the article expresses explicitly that the bulk of the action in 12 Angry Men revolves around two social psychological processes: minority influence and group polarization. Minority influence is the really interesting sort of micro-sociological one here, because it really talks about how people can be convinced by that one minority position and why they're convinced by that one minority position. So the main character, played by Henry Fonda, he is the one person who says not guilty at the beginning of the movie, and it's through his strength of conviction, it's through his dedication to sticking with what he believes, the passion with which he fights for what he believes, the patience he has, the logic he uses, all of these things work to convince the rest of the group to sort of stop and go, wait a minute, we don't necessarily have to stick with what everyone else thinks. Perhaps this one person who is brave enough to stand outside of the group, who's brave enough to separate themselves, make themselves an other. Maybe that person is worth listening to, and that's really what this idea of minority influence is. I'll put a proper definition up in the glossary on eClass for you, but that's sort of basically what it's talking about. And the movie also looks at group polarization. So when we have sort of halfway through the movie, we've got almost a 50-50 split of people fighting for guilty versus non-guilty, or versus not guilty. You can start to see really specific behaviors about how people try to fight for what they believe in, how they try to fight for their attitudes, how they justify their change in attitude. So, why do people, or why is it okay to start out by saying guilty and being so sure about it, and then later in the movie changing your mind? And why is that okay, and how do people justify it? These are all social psychological processes. I'm scrolling through the article again here. Other important things like the universal norm of reciprocity, where basically when somebody gives us something or does something for us, we feel obliged, or there's a social norm to owe them one, or to give them something back, to make ourselves equal. Marcel Mauss, actually, he's a sociologist who worked with Durkheim, and he wrote a book called The Gift, and that's a great book that talks about gift exchange and this idea of a norm of reciprocity. I give somebody a gift, there's an expectation from me and from them about the nature of this gift. The gift is a symbol. There's so many different levels, and that book goes into so many more details than I can go into here, but the main idea is I give a gift either because I want to be compassionate and I want to feel like I've helped somebody, or I genuinely see need and I want to give somebody something. That there's many different motivations that I might have, but once I make that gesture, there's a general social understanding that that person is going to have their own meaning, and they're going to want to give something back to me. So part of that can be seen in the film. There's the sort of the stick of gum thing. I was just reading a little bit here to remind myself, but there was a part of the movie where somebody offered somebody else a stick of gum, and that is representative of this gift-giving thing. So when, I believe it was, the article says, Henry Fonda took the piece of gum, there's this understanding of a relationship that develops. So I'm rambling a bit here, but that's the general idea. So giving and reciprocity and norms and exchange, these are all given through symbols, whether it's a piece of gum, whether it's through words, gifts of money, whatever it is, and they can be quite complicated, but they are there. There's a lot of social performance that goes on in that movie as well. So the difference between when they vote openly, when they all put up their hands to vote one way or the other, versus when they have the private vote, and that private vote is really where things start to turn around, when people can vote without being judged and without being explicitly pointed out as, oh, you changed your mind. That part of the movie is really interesting because it looks at performance. So if I say not guilty, or sorry, let's try the other side. If I say somebody is guilty and I'm sitting in that room, the last thing I want is to look like I'm wrong or I made a mistake. I want to preserve my sense of self. I want to preserve everything I've done up to that point. I want to make myself credible. I want to make myself look good. So putting up my hand explicitly in the group and saying, okay, actually I changed my mind, that gives us a sense of weakness. Some people, it would give them a sense of weakness. Other people, it would give them a sense of confusion. Something we can call, or something that's called cognitive dissonance, which we'll talk about later. But basically the idea is if you do something counter to what you originally thought, you create a sense of discomfort in you. So if I originally said guilty and I switch to not guilty, I experience cognitive dissonance, which means I can't, my brain is trying to figure out why I did that. And I can feel the social discomfort of changing my mind in front of people. So I have to perform certain actions and change my attitude in certain ways to justify that change, to resolve the dissonance. So if I feel uncomfortable, I'm going to change how I act, I'm going to change how I think in order to make myself more comfortable with that change of perspective. So you can see that happen in the movie as well, when people start to change their mind. One sec. When people start to change their minds about things, they tend to justify and talk about it and explain it as it goes through. So that's a really interesting part of the movie. I don't know if I really, there's a lot more going on here, and I think I may pick some of them out as examples as we go through the course. So if I find that we need to talk about the ending where Henry Fonda convinces sort of the last dissenter, the angry father, when that change happens, there's a lot to talk about there. So I'm not going to talk about it right now, but again, something very interesting to focus on is the fact that this movie does cover so many different processes. And then, of course, the other thing about the movie is that we can use the dramaturgical perspective to analyze it and to analyze what happened. So if we look at page 16 to 17 of the Shulman book, or it's also considered chapter 1, section Analyzing Dramaturgy. So if we look there, when we're talking about not exactly Goffman, but we're talking about different perspectives, Shulman brings up Kenneth Burke and the 5 key elements that Kenneth Burke uses to analyze dramaturgy. And so we have the slide here that shows the 5 different things. So we have the act where people state what is done. And if we look at 12 Angry Men as the example, what was done? Deliberation over a trial. What were people doing? They were trying to figure out whether somebody was guilty or not guilty, whether they should get the death sentence or not. That's what they were doing. That's the act. That's what we're observing. The scene, the place, where and when the actions were done, was the jury room, primarily in the movie. So actually, that's where everything happened in the movie. We had that one room, and that was our setting, our scene. If we look at me recording the video right now, there's a setting, there's a scene going on around me. I'm sitting in front of a computer, there's a microphone right here, I have notes, I have all sorts of things, I have coffee and water, I have all these things around me that are helping assist with my performance, and they're where my performance is taking place. And so in 12 Angry Men, the jury room, the way the chairs are set up, the windows, the way that people walk over to the windows, where the bathroom is, all of those things, we can investigate to see how they impact the social interactions, how they impact the process that goes on in that group. The next key element that Burke talks about is the agent. So who engaged in the act? The performer. Who was the performer? And really the best way to describe that for the movie is each individual juror is a performer. Each of them engaged in the act. Each of them interacted with somebody else. They were all part of the movie. If we talk about my video right now, I'm the agent because I'm engaging in the act of performing for you. In the classroom, when you're watching this, you are agents by watching and choosing whether you watch or not, choosing whether you're sitting on Facebook on your phone, choosing whether you're working on a different class assignment or whether you're watching intently. You're the agent who's engaging in that act, in that situation. But right now, to me, you're the audience. So we're going to talk about that differentiation between you as the audience, me as the performer, and our mutual expectations for each other. In dramaturgy, we look at how these expectations influence both of our behaviors. I expect you to act a certain way. You expect me to act in a certain way. We act in certain ways based on those expectations and meanings. And we perform, and we interact. So anyway, returning to 12 Angry Men, the agents are each individual juror in the room. Makes sense? That's what I would say in class as I paused, so you could ask me a question. So if you have a question, write it down. All right. Okay, so the next thing the next key element that Burke looks at is the agency. So how the act was done. People looking at how things happen. If we look at 12 Angry Men, we can look at the social psychological processes that we just talked about, but we can also talk about things like logic, arguing, even fighting, the private ballots, the emotional pleas, the way that the breaks were taken, the way the evidence was called in, the way that that one argument was performed where Henry Fonda was walking across the room trying to time himself as if he was the old man who had witnessed, I believe it was the old man. Yes. He walks across the room as if he was that old man. That's, part of how he was doing the performance, how he was convincing people. And the reaction to it, I believe it was Cobb's character yelled at him and was like, say, hurry up, and that's not how slow he'd walk, etc., etc. That's the agency and how people were performing. And then finally, we look at the purpose. So we want to understand the purpose of the interaction, of the performance. And so this is where we start bringing in things like roles and expectations. Jury duty is a social expectation. There's an understanding about what jury duty is. Being a juror is a role. It's something that comes with expectations. The men knew that they had this kid's life in their hands. They knew they were there to make a life or death decision. How important that role was to each of them. The guy who wanted to go to the baseball game was more interested in being a baseball audience member than he was in being a juror. So the extent to which the different people played their roles, that really depended on the importance of the situation and the role for them, and even their knowledge of the role. So Henry Fonda knew that deliberation was about spending the time to make sure they covered all the bases. Baseball. Yeah. But anyway, Henry Fonda knew that was part of the process, so that character took the time to play his role really well, where some of the other jurors didn't. And the leader of the group had a role. He was the one who communicated with the bailiff to get evidence. He was the one who controlled voting. All of these people had different purposes, but generally the purpose was to determine whether the kid was guilty or not guilty. Yeah, so some guys played it better than others, and that's really what happens with roles in all the situations. So your role as student or my role as professor, how well we perform those roles there's so many different contributing factors. How long have you been a student? How many times have I taught? How many different classrooms have you been in? How many different professors have you had? You have certain meanings and expectations developed through these micro-sociological processes of symbolic interactionism. You've exchanged symbols with people, you have meanings, you have expectations, and you're going to interpret things based on those expectations, as am I. And so these are the fine-tuned things we're going to look at. So basically, to summarize, I'm not going to go through all the definitions again, but we're using the dramaturgical perspective to look at all of these different aspects of social psychology and interactions and how the presence of others impacts the performance and expectation that people have, their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors, how they protect their attitudes and their values. All of these things we're going to look at from the dramaturgical perspective, but really it is social psychology at large and also sociology. So the theories that we talk about are going to be useful if you are a sociologist or interested in other sociology courses. This is going to carry over for you quite well. One more drink of water. So hopefully what I portrayed to you today was the idea that this is going to be useful for you, and that we are going to study all of the important things that we need to study to move forward, but we're going to do it from a sociological perspective. So that's the point I wanted to get across. For Friday's class, I'm going to make another video, like I said, and we're going to continue our exploration of Chapter 1. So we're going to focus on Goffman himself and talk about those 6 principles of impression management. So we'll go into a lot of those details, excuse me. We'll also talk about George Herbert Mead, who was mentioned in the Schulman book, the concept of the self, and how the self comes into play in all of this, because we're talking about performance, but we are also talking about, because it's sociology, we're not talking about individuals, but we are. But we're going to talk about the social sense of self and what that means. And George Herbert Mead sort of started that whole thing. So we'll talk about him as well. So like I said, if you have any questions or comments, email me. My email is up on the slide. You don't have any assigned readings for next class, just review Chapter 1, maybe go over the 6 principles of impression management again, try to read through and see if there's anything that you missed, or feel free to read through the 12 Angry Men article again to see if it makes more sense or less sense now. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say was thank you to Dr. Googlis, who came in on Monday to talk about your character sheet assignment. If you have any questions about that, I will try to clarify on Monday in person, but if you have urgent questions, email me. The sheet is available for download on eClass, so you can go on there. I sent a large email that said this anyway, but I've got the Word version, and then I've got a real text file version, and one of those two should work for you, so you should be able to download it. You can type in the answers, you can take up as much extra space as you want, and I would like you to print it out for me and hand it to me in person on the due date on Friday the 26th. And then I also want you to email it to me, because we will be using that throughout the course. So that is your persona, that is the performance that you're going to use throughout the course. So we don't necessarily have to bring ourselves into everything we do. We can look at how we would perform based on these characters we've created. So with that, I am going to say farewell for now, and I'm looking forward to meeting you all. I will send another video out for Friday ideally, and we will get caught up and get through this course together. So thank you for your patience, and I will see you soon. Take care.